Hello students of A-Level Language and Literature, and welcome to another video from Excel at English, exploring one of the poems from the Meantime collection by Carol Ann Duffy. This video looks at the second poem in your anthology, which is called Nostalgia. Now, you should know that if you haven't already read the poem yourself, you need to pause the video now and do so, I suggest, at least 3 times. Reading it for meaning, but then in following readings, reading it aloud, experimenting with pace and expression so that you can explore the idea of voice and really feel your way into this poem. My reading would go a bit like this: Nostalgia. Those early mercenaries, it made them ill, leaving the mountains, leaving the high fine air to go down, down. What they got was money. Dull, crude coins clenched in the teeth, strange food, the wrong taste, stones in the belly, and the wrong sounds, the wrong smells, the wrong light, every breath, wrong. They had an ache here, doctor. They pined, wept, grown men. It was killing them. It was given a name. Hearing tell of it, there were those who stayed put, fearful of a sweet pain in the heart, of how it hurt in that heavier air to hear the sad music of home, the sad pipes, summoning, in the dwindling light of the plains, a particular place where maybe you met a girl or searched for a yellow ball in the long grass, found it just as your mother called you in. But the word was out. Some would never fall in love had they not heard of love. So the priest stood at the stile, with his head in his hands, crying at the workings of memory through the colour of leaves, and the school teacher opened a book to the scent of her youth, too late. It was spring when one returned, his life in a sack on his back, to find the same street, with the same sign on the inn, the same bell chiming the hour on the clock, and everything changed. So some key knowledge for you here. One piece of key knowledge really is the definition of nostalgia and how the term nostalgia came to be. I can't really do better than the opening paragraph of the Wikipedia page, so rather than paraphrase it, I put it in there word for word, and it tells us that the term was coined in 1688 by Johannes Hofner in a Basel dissertation. Hofner introduced nostalgia, or mal du pays, meaning homesickness, for a condition also known sometimes as mal du Suisse, or the Swiss illness, because it frequently occurred in Swiss mercenaries who, in the plains of lowlands France and Italy, were pining for their native mountain landscapes. The symptoms of nostalgia were thought to include fainting, high fever, indigestion, stomach pain, and death. A really interesting article there from The Atlantic if you feel like doing a bit of wider reading about when nostalgia was a disease. To summarise this poem, Duffy explores those feelings of nostalgia in a kind of a narrative format that reimagines the lives of those Swiss soldiers leaving their mountain homes. And the soldiers, as we see, become afflicted by this strange kind of emotional sickness. Quite obviously, I would say the theme of this poem is nostalgia, but also ideas about memory and time. Ideas about place, identity, leavings and returnings, homes and journeys. Ideas as well, secondarily, about family, about love and about beauty. With regard to voice, this poem I think has a kind of a storytelling narrative voice, but arguably you can look at the way that character voices on at least one occasion are kind of freely presented within the narrative. So it's basically a narrative storytelling voice. The message that Duffy is trying to convey about nostalgia, about the way that we feel about the places that we come from, is for you to determine as you develop your own personal response to the poem. So let's look at some of the analysis then. What are the distinctive linguistic features that we find within this poem? Well, firstly, there are a number of semantic deviations which we could call figurative language choices that are in some way unexpected or counterintuitive, different connections. Good example of that would be the oxymorons, sweet pain and heavier air. And these counterintuitive semantic devices are helping to present this feelings of disorientation or disconnection that nostalgia is provoking. We often describe nostalgia as bittersweet, which is in itself an oxymoron. Crying at the workings of memory through the colour of leaves, which is a description of the priest's sadness at the sty, is a really unexpected and quite challenging piece of figurative imagery, combining the concrete noun leaves and the abstract noun memory, combining two things that are really quite unlike and asking us to make really quite a significant semantic leap in meaning to consider how natural images, perhaps romanticized images of home, can have really great, powerful, emotive impact. If you're familiar with Labov's model of narrative structure, I think you can put forward quite a good argument that this poem fits some of those aspects of a narrative discourse structure. The title acts as an abstract, giving you the topic, and the introduction of the mercenaries coming down from the hills kind of orients the narrative by giving you an idea of the context in which events happen. We then get a sequence of events forming a kind of complications in the action. These are described using that past progressive aspect, leaving the mountains, hearing Tel Aviv crying, conveying a sense of continuous action within the narrative. We then get a kind of resolution, which is signified through an adverbial phrase which acts as a discourse marker. It was spring when, and that shows us that there's a significant shift in the narrative and that we're moving towards some kind of resolution. That resolution, of course, is one returning soldier who makes it home. And we then get this kind of ironic coda, which leaves us to reflect that whilst everything around is same, the final line, everything's changed, is one of those kind of semantic, counterintuitive, figurative devices, which asks us to really reflect on how puzzling and difficult a feeling nostalgia can be. Throughout the poem, Duffy uses mixed sentence forms, particularly mixes between longer and shorter forms. There are some very long, complex compound forms featuring complex lists and sort of parenthetical subclauses inserted in using a variety of different devices such as dashes and commas. These help to create a kind of melodramatic, slightly anguished, over-the-top register. There's a counterpoint to that effect in these short opening sentences, particularly in stanza 2 and 3, which act as kind of cohesive reminders to the subject of this story, nostalgia. They both use a key kind of discourse reference, referring back to the title by saying things such as, "The word was out." Here is a close analysis which helps to make that point in some ways. We could look at ideas such as Dexes, which is highlighted in blue there. Those early mercenaries, they had an ache here, doctor. This is an example of distal personal Dexes, those, which creates a sense of distance in the story between the reader and the subject, especially in conjunction with that adjective early. Those early mercenaries. It's got almost a kind of a once upon a time in a land far, far away storytelling register as it opens. And part of that is to do with distancing between the reader and the subject. And that's achieved through Dexis. Later, though, Duffy shifts using a proximal spatial Dexis, which we know conveys close relationships in space, and they help to convey a kind of direct voice, i.e. to capture the voice of a character within the story. They had an ache here, doctor. Now, if she had chosen "they had an ache there, doctor," it would have created an additional sense of distance. But actually, that little line, "they had an ache here, doctor," feels very much like it's the direct voice of a character within the story. And Duffy here is very skillfully slipping into character voice, combining kind of a narrative storytelling voice with direct voice of characters. That's achieved using those clever little shifts in Dexes. With regard to discourse, structure and cohesion, we already discussed some of the evaluating this poem using a model of narrative discourse structure. But we also have throughout this cohesion, we have the pronoun "it," which is an indeterminate pronoun, used throughout the poem as a kind of anaphoric reference. Anaphoric is a referencing backwards. The title of the poem is Nostalgia. Whenever you read "it" in these contexts, it's acting as a placeholder for the word nostalgia, but the word nostalgia is never itself mentioned in the poem. It's constantly referred back to with this kind of anaphoric reference. And this is an interesting effect of foregrounding those feelings as a kind of an unknown, mysterious experience for those men. It was given a name, the word was out. There's a sort of uncertainty about their experiences, and I think this is partly down to the fact that Duffy is telling the story about the discovery of something that was new and not necessarily understood to those Swiss mercenaries. So using a kind of ambiguous pronoun "it" in the body of the poem helps to capture some of that uncertainty. The short sentence in the final line there, "it was killing them," the final line of this stanza, I should say, has got that slightly hyperbolic tone, although some of the observed effects of nostalgia in the 17th century there seemed really quite powerful. I would argue that it's not possible to die of nostalgia, which is why I argue that this is a kind of hyperbolic language. Duffy, I think, throughout is using a somewhat deliberately melodramatic tone to describe the effects of nostalgia. This is a tendency for Duffy throughout her poems to sometimes lean towards really quite melodramatic, almost sometimes bordering on comic representations of serious subjects. You could argue that killing is used in a sense of a kind of a colloquial idiom. It was killing them. We use killing in flippant ways quite often in everyday spoken language. You might say, "this close analysis is really killing me." Of course, you don't mean literally. Interesting patterns that Duffy uses linked to her use of sentence structure. And we discussed before the use of long listing forms. Sometimes those can use very simple methods to create a kind of emphasis. We talked before about the idea that this poem can slip into character voice between a kind of a narrative description and a character voice. Here you notice in green we have the word "wrong" repeated over and over. This is a kind of an anaphoric repetition. Confusingly, anaphora in repetitive sentence structures means repeating something at the beginning of clauses or repeating identical sections at the beginning of clauses or phrases within a sentence, or creating a listing effect. It's got the same etymology as anaphoric reference, which we discussed in the red box, but it's actually a different kind of technique. If we read that sentence, you can see there's a very clear effect. They have crude coins clenched in the teeth, strange food, the wrong taste, stones in the belly and the wrong sounds, the wrong smells, the wrong light, every breath, wrong. The repetition of this simple adjective is conveying the mercenaries' distress, but establishing this pattern of anaphoric repetition, Duffy reverses it in the final phrase in order to end the sentence on the final word "wrong," which gives a kind of an emphatic emphasis. All emphasis is emphatic, and an emphatic ending to the sentence, a particular kind of impact. This repetition of quite simplistic lexis I would say is an attempt to kind of capture the mercenaries' voice. It is a blunt and unsophisticated way of describing their problems, and it captures the way that they themselves might complain that everything around them is wrong. It also arguably contributes to this melodramatic effect within the poem. Some ideas for connecting this poem to other poems within the collection. You might look at the way that familiar and unfamiliar places are presented in Stafford Afternoons, particularly the threatening wood and the horrible event that happens in the wood. You could look at the presentation of emotional conflict or mental health issues almost in Cliché Kid. You could consider the way that the past is presented in this poem compared with a poem like The Captain. And you could look at the power of words and the power of language, this poem very much being focused on the power of nostalgia and the power of some of the words used in Litany, which is another poem focused on language. You, of course, can decide your own connections and think about some of the poems that you know well and enjoy in this collection and find your own connections. Finally then, here is a complimentary poem because obviously it is not all about Duffy and it's important for you to understand a range of poems. This is from Rupert Brooke, which was written in 1914 in his collection 5 Sonnets, and a poem that turns out to have a tragic connection as Brooke lost his life in the First World War shortly after writing it. The Soldier. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave, once, her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's, breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness, in hearts at peace, under an English heaven. Thank you guys for your focus and attention. Don't forget to check out the other poems in this series.